Carolyn Shoemaker was an American astronomer who became an expert at identifying comets. She discovered or co-discovered dozens of comets and hundreds of asteroids. Perhaps the most famous among these was the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, which collided with Jupiter. By 1994, Shoemaker held more comet discoveries to her name than anyone else alive at the time. Although Shoemaker held an honorary degree from Northern Arizona University, she actually had no formal education in astronomy. She didn't begin working in the field until she was 51 years old, when she joined her husband, geologist Eugene Shoemaker, in his search for comets and asteroids near Earth. Carolyn Shoemaker was one of the most prolific comet and asteroid hunters of her time, and her discoveries made significant contributions to the field of astronomy. Today, we'll be taking a look at her life and the work that she did. Shoemaker was born as Carolyn Jean Spellman on June 24, 1929, in Gallup, New Mexico. Her family soon moved to Chico, California, where she grew up and attended high school. At Chico State College, now California State University, she earned master's degrees in history and political science. She also had a teaching credential and a contract to teach 7th graders. At her brother's wedding, Carolyn met the best man, Eugene Shoemaker. The two got along well, and they found that they had a lot in common. After the wedding, they exchanged letters for a year, and they eventually went on a camping trip that went so well it resulted in Jean proposing to Carolyn. The Shoemakers married on August 18, 1951, exactly a year after Carolyn's brother's wedding. The ceremony took place in Carolyn's hometown of Chico. For about a year, Carolyn taught high school while Jean continued his geological field work. However, Carolyn was unsatisfied with teaching, so she stopped working to stay home and raise their 3 kids, named Christine, Patrick, and Linda. Jean had a lifelong dream to go to the moon. In 1956, he tried to interest the United States Geological Survey in creating a geographical map of the moon, but this was sidelined by the agency's other priority, which during the Cold War was to find plutonium for nuclear weapons. Instead, Jean studied craters that formed after small nuclear test explosions. His study of these craters eventually led him and Carolyn to Meteor Crater in Arizona. At the time, Meteor Crater was mostly thought to be a dead volcano, but Jean believed that both it and the lunar craters had been made by asteroid impacts. In 1954, Jean was awarded his master's degree, and in 1960, he received his doctorate from Princeton with a thesis on Meteor Crater. He helped to provide some of the first conclusive evidence that Meteor Crater was, in fact, an impact site. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced that the United States would send humans to the moon. Unfortunately for Jean, he was unable to become an astronaut because he had Addison's disease, but he was still involved in the efforts to send people to Earth's only natural satellite. He helped NASA's Ranger missions, and he trained Apollo astronauts on how to do field geology. Jean's research on impact craters changed how scientists looked at craters on the Earth and the Moon. It also sparked his curiosity about the comets and asteroids that formed these craters, and with time, it led to Carolyn's new career. When Carolyn was 51 years old, all 3 of her children had grown up, graduated high school, and moved out. This left her wanting a new direction in life. She asked her husband if he had any ideas for what she could do. At the time, he was working on a plan to search for comets and asteroids using the 18-inch Schmidt telescope at the Palomar Observatory. So, to help Carolyn find something to do, Jean brought home a stereo microscope and a bunch of films that he hoped contained discovery images for new comets and asteroids. Carolyn's patience and attention to detail made her perfect for the job of searching these films for new objects. Eventually, Carolyn joined Jean to make observations on the telescope. They worked together for a bit before Jean moved over to the 48-inch. This left Carolyn by herself on the 18-inch, but she enjoyed making observations alone. In 1982, the Shoemakers launched the Palomar Asteroid and Comet Survey. Within 10 years, they were leaders in the discoveries of asteroids and comets. And of course, this led to them discovering one of the most famous comets ever. In March of 1993, Carolyn, Jean, David Levy, and Philippe Benjoya were at Palomar. The weather was not ideal for taking images of the sky, but they were assigned to go to the telescope, and so they went. They brought a special kind of film that would let them take shorter exposures of the sky, and therefore more exposures during the observation run. On the first night, however, they discovered the film was not exactly good. Someone had opened the box, exposed all of the film, and then closed it without telling Carolyn. Jean looked at the film box, and he dug down deep enough to find films that were usable, but the bad films combined with the unideal weather meant no one was particularly hopeful. On the second night, clouds were rolling in. Gene and Levy hurried out to the telescope to use some of the bad film to take some images, because well, it was already damaged, so if they got nothing out of it, it wouldn't exactly cost them to try. Then, on the fourth or fifth night, the weather was rainy. Carolyn was looking at the films that Gene and Levy took, and she noticed something odd. At first, she thought it might be because of Jupiter. It was visible in the film, and when it was visible, it often caused strange effects in the images. But the more she looked at it, the more she realized it wasn't because of Jupiter at all. She showed it to the others, and none of them could really figure out what it was. So they reported the position of the film to the Minor Planet Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Gene suggested it could be a broken comet, and not to give any spoilers, but he was completely right. Levy contacted Jim Scotty, who was at a more powerful telescope in Tucson. Scotty was able to confirm the discovery of Shoemaker-Levy 9, which by that point had already broken into multiple fragments orbiting around Jupiter. And eventually, it was determined that the comet would collide with Jupiter. Carolyn was initially sad to hear about this. She liked knowing that the comets she discovered were still out there and she knew where they were, and this made her feel like she was losing something. But she eventually came around and grew to be just as excited. And to commemorate the broken comet, Gene gifted Carolyn a string of pearls to replace what she had lost. In the early 1980s, the Shoemakers began traveling around the Australian outback every year to study old craters. On July 18th, 1997, they were on the 12th of such trips. While driving, they crashed into another car, and tragically, Gene died at 69 years old, while Carolyn was severely injured. After his death, Gene was cremated, and some of his ashes were scattered at Meteor Crater. Others were placed on NASA's Lunar Prospector spacecraft, and Carolyn was thrilled by the thought that, in some way, Gene might achieve his dream of going to the moon. She watched the launch of the spacecraft, which orbited the moon for about a year before a planned crash landing in a lunar crater. That crater was renamed to Shoemaker in Gene's honor. In the years after Gene's death, Carolyn would often look at the moon and pretend like she was talking to him. After recovering from the accident that took her husband's life, she continued her work in astronomy. Carolyn Shoemaker was recognized for her achievements many times during her life. She became a visiting scientist at the astrogeology branch of the USGS, the program her husband founded. She received numerous awards and honors, some of which she shared with her husband. There's even an asteroid named after her, 4446 Carolyn. Shoemaker passed away on August 13th, 2021 at 92 years old. She and Gene are remembered as being inseparable, and people who knew her recall her as a humble, patient, caring, and funny person. A lot of people view her as an inspiration and a role model, not just as a scientist, but also as a person. I hope you've enjoyed this summary on the life and work of Carolyn Shoemaker. I wanted to make a few videos on women in astronomy for March, which is Women's History Month, and I figured that since I already have a video on Shoemaker-Levy 9, it would be pretty appropriate to start with Carolyn Shoemaker. I plan to have 2 other videos out during this month, assuming nothing gets in the way. Thank you very much for watching. I would appreciate it if you could leave a like, and of course you can always subscribe if you would like to see more. I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next time.